They told me quite plainly that I was just clutter in their digital lives. It started with a simple phrase from my granddaughter, Sophie. Her voice clipped and impatient over the phone one afternoon when I was trying to share something precious to me, a memory wrapped in words and photos. "Grandma," she said, "it's just clutter. No one needs your rants clogging up the family chat." That was the moment I first felt the cold slip of invisibility, the quiet deletion not only of my messages, but of my presence. It was not the first time I had been made to feel superfluous, but it was the first time the silence was so sharp, so immediate, and so absolute. I'm 81 years old now, living in a modest flat above the neighborhood pharmacy, a place I call my own, though it was not always so. For many years, I shared a house with my daughter and her family, a home I helped pay for with money saved after my husband Peter died. It was a house full of screens and quiet corners, where laughter and conversation were often swallowed by the blue glow of smartphones and tablets, and where my voice was steadily being drowned out, first by polite neglect and then by digital erasure. I remember the early days when Sophie was small, the way her eyes would light up when I showed her old family albums, dusty and worn from use, filled with black and white photographs and yellowed letters from a time before phones were smart and connections fleeting. We had a secret ritual, a small bubble of warmth in the cold expanse of modern life, where I would tell stories of her great-grandmother's garden, the way the roses bloomed heavy and wild every June, and Sophie would listen, wide-eyed, clutching her tablet but looking up at me as if my words were the rarest treasure. But that ritual faded, replaced by shorter visits, more distractions, and fewer moments where I felt seen and heard. Then one day, it changed completely. I sent Sophie a message, a photo of a blooming rose bush in my window box, a recipe for the lemon tart her grandmother used to make, carefully typed and saved on my old phone. When I called to tell her, she laughed and said it was too much, irrelevant. And then, with a swipe that felt like a closing door, she deleted every message I had ever sent in our family group chat. I tried to reach out again, but my messages were ignored or disappeared before anyone could read them. It was as if I had become a ghost in their lives, visible only when it was convenient or necessary. The house grew quieter, the dinners less warm. I would speak and my words would hang in the air unanswered or met with polite glances towards glowing screens. The room would fill with the hum of technology, a constant background noise that drowned out my voice and erased my presence. I left little notes around the house, gentle reminders of birthdays and anniversaries, photographs carefully placed on the kitchen table, hoping someone might pause and remember. But more often than not, I found these notes tossed aside, crumpled like discarded thoughts. Once I overheard Sophie laughing with her friends about how Grandma still calls, how she can't believe Grandma still calls, as if it was some ancient, embarrassing ritual she had outgrown. That laughter, sharp and distant, cut deeper than any argument. I tried to explain, to bridge the gap between our worlds, but every effort seemed to make the silence grow heavier. Then, on a day that felt like any other but wasn't, I found Sophie's phone left unattended on the kitchen counter. The house was empty, the family out for the afternoon, caught up in their busy lives filled with concerts and social media. Her phone sat there vulnerable and inviting, a small gateway to a world where I no longer belonged. I took it quietly in my hands, the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. I didn't plan what I was about to do. It was not revenge or spite. It was calm, measured, an act of reclaiming something I had lost without realizing it until that moment. I removed her SIM card and replaced it with a blank one I had bought weeks earlier, a cheap substitute without a plan or data. It felt strange, almost like a ritual, an exchange of power in a world ruled by unseen codes and digital threads. The silence that followed was profound. Sophie's phone went dark to the outside world. Messages she expected never came. The household soon erupted with confusion and frustration. But I sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, feeling a strange peace. This was not about punishment. It was about drawing a line, about saying without words that I would not be erased quietly anymore. The family's reaction was swift and cold. They told me I had to leave, not with shouts or accusations, but with a quietness so profound it was almost worse. "This isn't working anymore, Mum. You need your own space," my daughter said, her voice even but firm. I packed my belongings without argument, taking only what mattered: Peter's old watch, the recipe cards worn with age, the photograph of Sophie in my arms, a tiny baby who once needed me and saw me clearly. I left the spare key on the kitchen counter, a silent farewell to the life I had once known. Before I left, I slipped a small note into Sophie's desk drawer, just one sentence that carried years of love, pain, and memory. When your memory fails you, remember who remembered you first. Now, in my quiet flat above the pharmacy, the light is softer, the streets calmer. I carry a simple flip phone, no group chats, no muting, no deletion. When I send a message, it is to one person at a time, and if no one replies, I still know I spoke. Some evenings I write postcards to myself, lining them along the windowsill as proof that I was here, that I still am. To any woman who feels herself slipping into silence, erased by those she once held dear, I say this: if they erase you, write again. If they mute you, speak louder, but not for them. Speak for yourself. Your voice is yours to keep, no matter how many times they try to delete it. You are not clutter. You are not invisible. You are the keeper of your own stories, and those stories matter. It happened quietly at first, almost unnoticed, but the sting of it hit me deep and sudden, like a winter chill creeping into the bones when you thought spring was near. The day Sophie deleted my messages was not a moment of loud confrontation or dramatic outburst. It was a quiet act that shattered the fragile bridge I had tried so hard to build. I had sent her a message early that morning, a small digital gift, a photo of the old garden behind my apartment, the one where her great-grandmother had planted lilacs and jasmine that bloomed every spring without fail. Along with the photo, I wrote out a recipe for the rhubarb pie I used to bake when she was a child, hoping to spark a memory, to rekindle a connection that felt as if it was slipping through my fingers like sand. When I called later that day to see if she had received it, her voice was cold, clipped, as if speaking to a stranger. "Grandma, it's just clutter. No one wants to see that stuff anymore." The words fell on me like frost, numbing and sharp. Then, with a flick of her thumb, every message I had ever sent in the family group chat vanished, gone without warning or explanation. I stared at my phone, disbelief washing over me like a cold wave. All those words, memories, attempts at connection erased in an instant. At first, I thought it must have been a mistake, some accidental swipe or technical glitch. But the silence that followed was anything but accidental. My messages stopped being acknowledged. Replies ceased. The group chat continued without me, as if I had never existed. I watched from the sidelines as they shared plans, jokes, photos, worlds I was no longer a part of. It was not just digital deletion, it felt like a personal exile. I began to notice the shift in the house, the way Sophie and my daughter exchanged glances when I spoke, the way conversations hushed when I entered the room. I was no longer a participant, but a background noise, a fading echo in a place that once felt like home. The more I reached out, the thicker the wall became. I left notes on the kitchen table, reminders of birthdays, simple requests for a phone call, small gestures meant to keep a thread of connection alive. But more often than not, these notes were found crumpled or discarded. Once, I overheard Sophie laughing with her friends about me, how I still called and texted, how I was stuck in the past. That laughter, distant and sharp, cut deeper than any spoken insult. I tried to understand what I had done wrong. Had I become too much, too old-fashioned, too loud in a world that prized silence and screens? The days grew longer and lonelier. My presence was tolerated but never welcomed. At night, I would sit by the window, watching the glow of their devices as they lit up faces more distant than the stars outside. Then came the moment that changed everything, a moment born out of quiet desperation and the need to reclaim a sliver of control. The house was empty. Sophie and the family had gone out for an evening event, leaving her phone unattended on the kitchen counter. It was a fragile invitation, a crack in the digital fortress that had been built around me. I picked up the phone, feeling the weight of years pressing down on my hands. The device was cold and unfamiliar, a gateway to a world where I was no longer welcome. I hesitated, the memory of the deleted messages flooding my mind, the sting of rejection burning bright. Without a plan, without malice, I reached for the SIM card, a tiny chip that held the key to connection, and gently removed it. In its place, I slipped a blank SIM I had purchased weeks ago, cheap and unassuming, without data or plan. It was a small act, almost symbolic, but it felt like reclaiming a voice that had been silenced. When Sophie returned and found her phone dead to the world, panic set in. Messages failed to send. Calls went unanswered. Confusion turned to frustration, frustration to anger. The household erupted with questions and accusations. My daughter confronted me quietly, her eyes wary but searching. "Did you do this?" she asked. I met her gaze and said calmly, "I returned the favor." It was a phrase heavy with meaning, one that neither of us wanted to unpack fully. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. They told me I no longer belonged in their home, not with shouts, but with a coldness that froze the air between us. "You need your own space," my daughter said, her voice steady but unyielding. I packed my belongings quietly, taking only what mattered. The watch Peter left me, the worn recipe cards, the photograph of Sophie as a baby in my arms. I left the key on the kitchen counter, a silent farewell to a life that had slowly slipped away. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange mix of loss and liberation. The house was no longer mine, but neither was I lost. Before I left, I slipped a note into Sophie's desk drawer, a single sentence carrying a lifetime of love and memory. When your memory fails you, remember who remembered you first. Now, living alone in my small flat above the pharmacy, the silence is softer, less suffocating. I carry a simple phone, one that cannot be muted or deleted. When I send a message, it is to one person at a time. And even if there is no reply, I know I have spoken my truth. To anyone who feels themselves erased, I say this: sometimes the harshest silence is a call to reclaim your voice, to speak not for their ears, but for your own heart. After that quiet yet irrevocable act of removing Sophie's SIM card and inserting the blank replacement, the house seemed to shift its atmosphere in a way that was subtle but impossible to ignore. It was not just the silence of unanswered calls or undelivered messages. It was a slow, creeping distance that began to grow between me and the people I once called family, a distance that no amount of knocking or pleading could bridge. The days that followed were marked by a growing sense of invisibility, not just online, but in every shared moment, every glance, every conversation that went on without me. I began to notice how they moved through the house with a new rhythm, one that carefully avoided my presence. Sophie's eyes no longer met mine when I entered the room. My daughter's tone was clipped and businesslike, devoid of the warmth I once took for granted. I became a background noise, a shadow that lingered at the edges of their lives but was never fully seen. I tried to hold on to what was left of connection, reaching out in small ways, offering to help with meals, asking about their days, sharing memories from the past, but my words seemed to dissolve into the air before anyone could grasp them. It was as though the digital erasure had seeped into the very fabric of our family, unraveling the threads that had once held us together. I began to retreat into myself, the quiet growing louder with each passing day. The technology that had once promised connection now felt like a barrier, a wall built of invisible bricks that separated me from the warmth of belonging. I found myself sitting alone in the evenings, the glow of my simple phone screen a pale substitute for the conversations that no longer came. The family's group chat continued without me, messages flooding in with plans and jokes that I could neither see nor join. The laughter I once shared with Sophie was replaced by the hum of notifications I was no longer part of. I started to keep a journal, pouring my thoughts onto paper, hoping that the act of writing might hold some kind of lifeline to the world outside my solitude. I wrote about the garden my grandmother had tended, about the rhubarb pie recipe, about the feeling of being deleted not just digitally, but emotionally. Each word was a small rebellion against the silence that threatened to swallow me whole. I also found solace in the small routines I could still control. The careful brewing of tea in the morning, the tending of the few plants I kept on my windowsill, the folding of clean laundry with deliberate care. These rituals became anchors, moments where I could remind myself that I still existed, still mattered, even if they chose not to see me. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the house grew thicker. The once familiar laughter and chatter were replaced by whispered conversations behind closed doors, the occasional sharp glance exchanged when I was near. I overheard snippets of conversations, words like too much, outdated, embarrassing, and felt each one like a blade pressed gently against my ribs. Sophie's friends, who once greeted me with shy smiles, now avoided eye contact, their whispers trailing off whenever I approached. The digital world that had become their primary reality seemed to reject me utterly, and with it, so did the people I loved. One afternoon, I found a small note tucked beneath my plate at the dinner table. It was brief and cold. Please keep your messages to yourself. No signature, no warmth, just a boundary set in ink. It was a clear message that my attempts to stay connected were no longer welcome. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my pocket, the paper crisp against my fingers. The sting of rejection was sharper than any spoken insult. Yet amidst this growing isolation, I began to see moments of quiet resistance within myself. I realized that the silence forced upon me was not the end, but a beginning, a painful but necessary step toward reclaiming my own voice and space. I started to spend more time outside the house, walking slowly through the neighborhood, noticing the small details I had long overlooked. The way sun caught on the leaves, the scent of freshly baked bread from the corner bakery, the laughter of children playing in the park. These moments became small acts of reclaiming joy, pieces of a life that was not defined by exclusion. I also reached out to old friends I had lost touch with over the years, sending letters and making calls that were sometimes answered, sometimes not. Each connection, no matter how fragile, was a reminder that I was still part of a larger world beyond the walls that had closed in around me. Inside the house, the tension continued to build. One evening, I overheard my daughter speaking to Sophie in a hushed, urgent tone about setting boundaries and keeping things under control. It was then I understood that the removal of my digital presence was part of a larger effort to rewrite the story of who I was in their lives, a story where I was no longer the matriarch, the keeper of memories, or the source of wisdom, but a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be minimized. I found myself caught between worlds, the one I had known, filled with love and shared history, and the one they were creating, a curated reality where I no longer fit. The digital erasure was not just about messages, it was about identity, belonging, and power. As the weeks stretched on, the house felt increasingly unfamiliar, a place where I was tolerated but never truly welcome. Yet within me, a quiet fire began to kindle, the determination to not be erased, to not let my story be rewritten without my consent. I started to gather small tokens of my past, photographs, letters, recipes, things that could not be deleted or muted, things that carried the weight of memory and love. I began to prepare for a life where I would no longer be defined by their acceptance or rejection, but by my own choices and dignity. The first escalation was not marked by dramatic confrontation or fiery speeches, but by a slow, inexorable fading of my presence in their world. Yet it was also the moment when I began to realize that fading away was not my destiny. It was the moment when I started to walk quietly toward reclaiming my own life, even if that path meant leaving behind the family that once defined me. In those long, silent days, I learned that sometimes the deepest battles are fought not with anger or tears, but with quiet endurance and the steadfast refusal to disappear. In the midst of growing distance and silent rejection, something inside me began to shift, a quiet stirring that marked the turning point between despair and resilience. The days of fading away had led me to a moment of clarity, where the pain of being erased transformed into a resolve to reclaim my voice and presence on my own terms. I realized that waiting for them to see me, to hear me, was a path strewn with disappointment. Instead, I would step forward into a new life, one not dependent on their acceptance, but built on my own strength and choices. It started with small acts of rebellion, not loud or confrontational, but deeply symbolic. I began by finding a space of my own, a refuge where I could breathe without the weight of their judgments or the constant hum of dismissal. I rented a modest flat above the local pharmacy, a quiet place with a window that caught the morning sun and a door that locked firmly behind me. The space was humble, filled with the scent of old books and fresh coffee, but it was mine. In that room, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of trying to please and belong. I unpacked the photographs and letters I had gathered, laying them out carefully on the small wooden table, creating a sanctuary of memory and identity. Each picture, each note was a testament to a life lived with love and purpose, a life that no digital deletion could erase. I also embraced the rituals that gave me comfort and connection. A cup of tea brewed with care, a well-worn recipe book open to familiar pages, the gentle tending of the plants on my windowsill. These simple acts grounded me in the present and connected me to a lineage of strength and endurance that stretched back through generations of women who had faced their own trials and emerged whole. Work became a new rhythm in my life, a way to reclaim not just my time, but my sense of value and contribution. I found a job at a small neighborhood cafe where the scent of coffee and fresh pastries mingled with the quiet chatter of regular customers. The work was humble, pouring cups, wiping tables, remembering orders, but it was honest and steady. Each shift was a small victory, a step away from the shadows of rejection and toward the light of self-reliance. The first paycheck I earned in decades was more than money. It was proof that I could stand on my own, that I could build a life beyond the walls that had closed around me. With that money, I bought myself a coat, a navy woolen garment with deep pockets and a subtle pattern that felt like an armor against the cold and the world's indifference. Wearing it, I felt a surge of pride and self-respect, as if I were wrapping myself not just in fabric, but in the very dignity I had long been denied. The social ties I had lost began to shift as well. Old friends reached out cautiously, and I opened the door to new connections with neighbors and colleagues who saw me not as a fading shadow, but as a woman with stories and strength. I learned to say no to invitations that felt draining, and yes to moments of genuine joy and companionship. The garden behind my flat became a place of solace and renewal, where the lilacs and jasmine bloomed as they had for generations before me. Tending to the plants was a meditation, a way to nurture life even as I rebuilt my own. Letters came from unexpected places, notes from grandchildren who still remembered, postcards from friends who had not forgotten. These small threads of connection wove a new tapestry of belonging, one crafted on my terms. Inside me, the narrative of victimhood began to fade, replaced by a story of survival and quiet triumph. I was no longer the woman waiting for permission to exist. I was the author of my own life, writing each page with deliberate care and fierce love. The turning point was not a moment of dramatic confrontation, but a steady, ongoing act of choosing myself each day. It was the decision to leave behind the roles imposed on me, the forgotten grandmother, the ignored voice, and to step fully into the present with all its challenges and possibilities. This shift did not erase the pain or the memories, but it transformed them into sources of strength rather than chains. I learned that healing is not linear or neat. It is a messy, beautiful unfolding that requires patience, courage, and sometimes solitude. The quiet mornings in my flat, the steady rhythm of work, the small acts of self-care, all became the foundation of a new life built on resilience. And with this foundation came a peace I had not known in years, a calm assurance that I was enough exactly as I was. To any woman who finds herself lost in silence, erased by those she once trusted, I offer this truth. The middle point, the place where despair shifts to hope, is within you. It is found in the choices you make to stand for yourself, to honor your own voice, and to claim your place in the world. The path is not always clear and the road is often lonely, but it leads to a life of your own making, a life of quiet dignity, fierce love, and enduring strength. The calm I had begun to build, the fragile sense of stability I was nurturing in my new life, was not meant to last unchallenged. Just as a gentle breeze can swell into a storm without warning, so too did the past I had tried to leave behind return to test the boundaries of my resolve. The arrival of the letter from Kieran, my eldest grandchild, was the first sign that the ties I thought severed were not so easily broken. His handwriting, familiar and tender, carried with it a mixture of worry and hope that stirred something deep within me, a bittersweet reminder of the family I once held close. The letter was brief, a few lines filled with questions and an invitation to reach out, to reconnect. Kieran spoke of his own struggles, the weight of expectations, and the loneliness he sometimes felt despite the digital connections that surrounded him. Reading his words, I felt both the ache of distance and the flicker of a bond that had survived the silence. Yet this fragile thread was soon tested by the arrival of Lisa, my daughter-in-law, who appeared at the cafe unannounced, her presence both a challenge and a reminder of the world I had stepped away from. Lisa was not the warm, welcoming woman I had once hoped she might be. Instead, she carried with her the cold efficiency of someone determined to restore order and control. She spoke of panic and fear, painting a picture of a family unraveling without my presence, of children confused and spouses strained. Her words were laced with the language of responsibility and concern, but beneath it lay an undercurrent of accusation and dismissal. The conversations that followed were tinged with the tension of power struggles, the subtle battles fought not with raised voices, but with calculated silences and measured phrases. Adam, my son, soon enlisted legal counsel, sending a representative to speak with me about my well-being and the management of my affairs. The lawyer's visit was a stark intrusion into the new life I was crafting, a reminder that the past was not content to fade quietly, but sought to assert itself through formal channels and veiled threats. The discussions were cold and clinical, stripping away the warmth of family ties and replacing them with contractual obligations and questions of competence. I met each challenge with quiet strength, refusing to be diminished or defined by their terms. I reminded them, and myself, that my mind was sound, my environment safe, and my choices my own. This assertion of autonomy was met with resistance, attempts to question my decisions and to pressure me into agreements that felt like cages rather than protections. Meanwhile, the community around me responded in unexpected ways. A local newspaper published an article that cast me as a missing matriarch, a figure of concern and vulnerability to be watched over rather than a woman of agency and will. The article quoted family members expressing worry and confusion, portraying me as a fragile figure lost to the modern world. Reading those words, I laughed quietly, the sound sharp and surprising even to myself. Their portrayal was a mirror held up to the world's assumptions about age, family, and worth, a performance of innocence and helplessness that ignored the reality of my quiet rebellion. The cafe became a small stage where these dramas played out in glimpses and whispers. Heather, the manager who had hired me, watched with quiet sympathy as I navigated the pressures from a world that sought to define me by its narrow terms. Arthur, a widower who had become a steady presence in my days, offered companionship without expectations, a reminder that connection could be simple and sincere. Their presence was a balm, softening the sharp edges of conflict and offering glimpses of a life rebuilt on mutual respect rather than obligation. The tension escalated further when Lisa returned, this time not as an unannounced visitor, but as someone seeking to negotiate, to assert her place in the story I was rewriting. Our conversations were fraught with unspoken grievances and the weight of years spent trying to fit me into a role I no longer accepted. She spoke of fear and misunderstanding, of a desire to protect family harmony, even as the methods felt controlling and dismissive. I listened without interruption, acknowledging her fears but standing firm in my truth. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said quietly one afternoon, her voice stripped of pretense. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." Her words hung between us, an admission of the delicate balance between presence and absence, between love and control. I responded with a calm that surprised even me. "I'm not your shadow, Lisa," I said. "I'm my own person, and I finally remembered how to be one." Those words marked a turning point, a refusal to be defined by others' fears or expectations, a reclaiming of self beyond the boundaries they sought to impose. The legal letters continued, the conversations persisted, but beneath the surface, a new story was unfolding, one where I was no longer a passive figure in their narrative, but an active author of my own life. I began to build new connections, nurturing friendships and small communities that valued me for who I was, not for the roles I had once played. The simple routines of work and companionship grounded me, and the small acts of rebellion, the letters I wrote but did not send, the quiet refusals to be drawn into old dramas, became the threads of a new life tapestry. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the paradox of the past, pressing in even as I stepped forward, the tension between letting go and holding on. It was a dance of boundaries and bridges, of loss and renewal. I learned that true strength is not in denying pain, but in facing it with grace and determination. To any woman who finds herself caught between worlds, who feels the weight of history pressing on her shoulders, I offer this. The second escalation is not the end, but a test, a challenge to your resolve and a call to your courage. It is the moment when you choose not to retreat but to stand, not to surrender but to claim your space with quiet dignity and fierce love. The storm may rage, but within you lies a calm unshaken, a light unextinguished, a voice that will not be silenced. The moment of culmination came not with a shout or a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet, deliberate act of drawing a line in the sand, an act that was as much about reclaiming my dignity as it was about setting the terms of my existence moving forward. After weeks of mounting pressure of legal notices and veiled ultimatums, I knew that the time had come to speak clearly and firmly, not just to them, but to myself. I sat at my small kitchen table, the letter before me, its blank pages waiting for the weight of my words. I picked up my pen with a steady hand, the familiar motion grounding me amid the swirling storm. I wrote slowly, each sentence a statement of resolve, each word a step away from the shadows of doubt and into the light of self-determination. "To whom it may concern," I began, a phrase formal and detached, yet in that formality lay my power. I declared that I was of sound mind, living in a safe environment of my choosing, and that any further attempts at contact under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I had retained local legal counsel, I wrote, making it clear that I was prepared to defend my autonomy. This letter was not just a response to the lawyer's visit. It was a manifesto of independence, a declaration that the control others sought to impose on me would no longer be tolerated. I sealed the letter with deliberate care and placed it in the mailbox the next morning, feeling a mix of relief and resolve settle over me. That same day, I penned another letter, this one addressed to Lisa. It was brief, 3 lines that carried years of unspoken truths. I acknowledged that I knew what she had done and what she had left unsaid. I told her I was not angry, only done. I made it clear that I would not be returning, that she needed to take care of her own life now, and I was finally starting mine. I mailed this letter with a stamp bearing the image of a finch, a small bird known for singing even in the coldest weather, a symbol of resilience and hope. The days that followed were a strange mixture of silence and expectation. I did not know what response, if any, would come, but I felt a calm certainty that I had taken the necessary step toward freedom. Then, unexpectedly, Lisa arrived in person, standing stiffly in the cafe where I worked, her presence a reminder of the worlds I had left behind. She did not come to beg or plead, but to negotiate the space between us, to seek understanding, if not forgiveness. Our conversation was careful and measured, a delicate dance of emotions and truths. She admitted to panic and fear, to the desire to protect a family that felt fractured without me, yet her words also carried the weight of control and dismissal. I listened, acknowledging her fears but holding firm to my boundaries. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said softly, the armor of politeness slipping to reveal a hint of vulnerability. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." Her confession hung between us like a fragile bridge. I met her gaze steadily. "I'm not your shadow," I replied. "I'm my own person," and I finally remembered how to be one. That moment was both an ending and a beginning, the closing of a chapter written by others and the opening of a new one authored by me. The legal threats and familial pressures continued in the background, but they no longer held sway over my spirit. I had drawn my line, and beyond it stretched a life defined by my choices, not by the expectations or demands of others. I began to build new connections, friendships grounded in mutual respect and kindness, moments of genuine joy untainted by past wounds. The simple routines of work and quiet companionship with neighbors became the foundation of a life reclaimed. In the evenings, I sat by my window, watching the sky darken and the stars emerge, feeling a peace that had once seemed impossible. The past still whispered, but it no longer controlled me. I was free to live on my terms, to embrace the woman I had become, resilient, whole, and unapologetically myself. To any woman who finds herself at the edge of surrender, I offer this. The climax of your journey is not in the battles you fight or the voices you silence, but in the moment you stand, unwavering in your truth, and claim your life back, piece by piece, with quiet courage and fierce love. The path ahead may be uncertain, but the power to walk it belongs to you, and that power is unstoppable. After the storm of confrontation had passed, a calm settled over my life that felt both strange and deeply welcome. The fights, the letters, the visits, all the noise of the past faded into echoes, distant yet instructive, teaching me lessons I had long avoided. I found myself alone in my small flat, the quiet wrapping around me like a soft shawl, and for the first time in many years, I felt truly at peace. It was not the peace of forgetting or erasing the pain, but the peace of acceptance and renewal. I spent my days in gentle routines, brewing tea with deliberate care, reading old books that smelled of time, and watching the seasons shift through my window. The navy coat I had bought with my own hands hung by the door, a symbol of the woman I had become. strong, self-respecting, and unyielding. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Kieran. His handwriting, large and deliberate, spoke of a young man reaching out across the years, offering reconciliation without expectation or demand. He wrote that he would be coming to visit, that he wanted to speak with me alone, to rebuild what distance and silence had frayed. The thought of seeing him filled me with a mixture of hope and nervousness, a reminder that while some ties had broken, others remained intact, ready to be nurtured anew. When Kieran arrived, we met not with tears or grand declarations, but with quiet conversation and the simple, profound presence of one another. We spoke of small things, his work at a bookstore, my new life in the neighborhood cafe, and of larger truths, the pain of absence, the courage of survival, and the fragile beauty of second chances. There was no rush, no pressure to fix the past, only a shared understanding that love could take many forms and that healing was a journey walked together in small steps. Our reunion was a balm, a soft light in the twilight of years filled with shadows and doubts. After Kieran left, the days unfolded with a gentle rhythm. I found joy in unexpected places, a smile from a neighbor, the warmth of a cat curled in my lap, the taste of freshly baked bread shared with new friends. The community that had once seemed distant and cold became a tapestry of connections that grounded me in the present and gave me strength for the future. I continued to write letters, not always sent, to those who had hurt me, those I missed, and most importantly to myself. One such letter I tucked inside my dresser drawer, a message of self-love and affirmation for times when doubt crept close. It read, "Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. Look at the life that opened. Well done." These words became my anchor, a reminder that the greatest act of courage was to choose oneself when no one else would. Life was not perfect, nor was it without sorrow, but it was mine, authentic, unguarded, and fiercely lived. I understood that the family I had left behind was a chapter closed, a story rewritten without me, and that was okay. I had found a new family in those who accepted me fully, who saw me not as a burden or an obligation, but as a woman deserving of respect and love. In the quiet moments, I often thought of the women who might be listening to my story now, those who felt invisible or discarded, who struggled to find their voice amid the noise of rejection. To them, I say, you are not alone. Your story is not over. There is power in choosing yourself, in standing firm when the world tries to push you aside. The path may be lonely at times, but it leads to a life reclaimed, a life where your worth is not measured by others' acceptance, but by your own unwavering truth. If this story finds you at the right moment, do not wait for permission or perfect timing. Be your own sign, your own noise in the silence. Step away from the shadows cast by those who failed to see you and walk into the light of your own making. And when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, listening, ready to hold your story with the tenderness and strength it deserves. After all that had been said and done, after the letters and the boundaries and the moments of standing firm in the face of pressure, I found myself inhabiting a life that was at once smaller in its scale and infinitely larger in its meaning. I had thought, when I first left the house that had been both my home and my prison, that the loneliness would be unbearable, that the silence would press down on me until I could no longer breathe. But instead, I found that silence could be shaped, could be molded into something that nourished rather than suffocated. It became a companion rather than an enemy. I began to realize that the greatest change had not been in the physical space I occupied, but in the space within myself. For so many years, my life had been lived in response to others, responding to their needs, their moods, their demands, their rejections. My own wants had been folded away like a handkerchief placed in the back of a drawer, forgotten until one day you stumble across it and remember what it feels like against your skin. Now each day I unfolded a little more of that hidden fabric, smoothing it out, letting it breathe in the air of my own attention. The cafe continued to be a place where I was not just tolerated but welcomed. I learned the orders of regular customers by heart and could tell from the way a person stepped through the door whether they needed conversation or quiet. In a world where I had been told I was too much, too outdated, here I was simply enough. Arthur, the widower who had become a kind of anchor in my weeks, sometimes walked me home, and though nothing about our companionship was romantic, it was a reminder that connection could exist without the undercurrents of control or expectation. On one such evening, as we passed the bus stop on the edge of the park, I saw a young girl sitting with her head bent over her phone, her shoulders hunched in the same posture I had seen in Sophie so many times. There was a pang of recognition, a mixture of affection and loss, and I wondered whether she, too, had someone in her life trying to reach her through words she would one day wish she had not deleted. That thought stayed with me for days, not as a source of pain, but as a quiet truth about the way people grow and how they often have to lose something before they know its worth. Kieran kept his promise to visit from time to time, and our conversations became a thread I cherished. We never spoke ill of the others. It was an unspoken agreement that our time together would be about building something new rather than dissecting what had been destroyed. He once told me, his voice quiet but certain, "You're the same as you always were, Grandma. You just finally get to be yourself all the time now." I held on to those words as though they were a precious stone, turning them over in my mind on the days when shadows crept in. The garden behind my building became a project that occupied both my hands and my heart. I planted herbs and flowers, tended the soil with care, and found joy in watching something grow under my attention. It was not just a pastime, it was a way of telling myself over and over that I could cultivate life, even in a place where nothing had grown before. Sometimes neighbors would stop to admire the blooms, and in those moments I felt a part of something larger, a quiet web of connection spun from shared beauty. There were still letters I never sent. Some I wrote to Sophie, not because I believed she would read them or that they would change anything, but because there were things I needed to say without the risk of them being erased. In those letters, I told her about my days, about the way the morning light came through the window, about the cafe and the garden, about the times I'd been happy before she was even born. I did not write to accuse or to guilt her. I wrote to keep a record of my love, should she one day go searching for it. I kept them in a small wooden box, each envelope dated, as though I were saving seeds for a season that might or might not come. My daughter wrote only once, a short note that thanked me for respecting the family's boundaries and hoped I was finding contentment. It was signed not with love, but with her name, a formality that stung even as it confirmed the truth I had longs accepted. The version of family they wanted me to be part of was not one I could survive in. There was no anger left in me for them, only a kind of mourning that had settled into the background of my days, like a picture on the wall that you stop noticing until you catch it out of the corner of your eye. I learned in these months that endings are rarely clean. There are always threads left loose, always what-ifs and maybes, but there is also the possibility of weaving those threads into something entirely new. The life I was building was not free of loss, but it was free of the particular kind of diminishing that had once been my daily reality. I did not have to fight to be heard here. I only had to speak. The coat I had bought remained my silent companion, worn often as I walked through the market or down the quiet streets of my neighborhood. It reminded me of the day I had decided to choose myself, to make a purchase that was for no one's benefit but my own. I sometimes caught sight of my reflection in shop windows and was startled by the woman I saw there, not because she looked unfamiliar, but because she looked so utterly herself. The tilt of her chin, the set of her shoulders, the clear, unflinching gaze. It was a face I wished I could have shown the younger version of me, the one who thought she had to shrink to be allowed to stay. And perhaps that was the truest change of all. I no longer lived in a state of waiting. I was not waiting for an apology that would never come, nor for an invitation that might be rescinded, nor for a moment when I would be deemed worthy again. Worthiness was no longer something I measured against other people's yardsticks. It was something I felt in the quiet of my own heart, in the steadiness of my own two hands as they brewed tea or pruned a rose bush. I sometimes imagined what I would say if Sophie appeared at my door one day, older and softened by her own life's trials. I think I would invite her in, offer her tea, and listen to her story before deciding whether to tell her mine. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not about excusing what had been done, but about releasing myself from the endless replay of it. In this new life, I could hold both the wound and the healing in the same breath. To the women who might be listening to this now, who have found themselves reduced to background noise in their own families, I say this: the silence they impose on you is not the same as peace. Peace is something you build yourself, brick by brick, in a place where your voice is welcome and your presence is valued. It may be a smaller place than the one you once inhabited, but it will be yours, and that makes it vast in a way that matters. You do not have to wait to be invited back into a story that does not honor you. You can start your own chapter at any time, in any place, with nothing more than the decision that you deserve to be the main character in your own life. And once you make that choice, you will find, as I did, that the world becomes both larger and kinder, and that the truest family is made not by blood alone, but by mutual care and recognition. I am no longer the woman whose messages could be deleted without thought, whose voice could be silenced with a swipe of a screen. I am the woman who writes her own messages now, who decides where they go and who sees them. And whether they are read or not, I know that they exist, and so do I. That, in the end, is enough.